Hello, everyone. I'm Daz, and welcome to American Civil War and UK History. This presentation is available as a video on our YouTube channel or as a podcast from wherever you get your podcasts from. And if you're watching on YouTube, remember to hit that subscribe button and give us a big thumbs up. And to keep up to date with everything American Civil War and UK History, check out our website where you'll find blog posts, podcasts, and links to all of our social media pages. The link is available in the podcast description. And joining me today is historian, podcaster, and battlefield guide, Joe Ricci. Welcome, Joe.
Darren, it's good to be here.
Okay, as it is your first time on American Civil War and UK history, could you please tell everyone how you first became interested in history?
So my long-standing joke is that I never really stood a chance. My mom and dad met, and one of their first dates was to go see the movie Gettysburg. And then my mom was a museum director. My dad's been interested in history his whole life. It was sort of preordained that I was just gonna do this. So then I went to school. Naturally, all the subjects that everybody has to take, reading and English and all that, and math. Math never really sat right. Science never really sat right. But there's one thing I loved, which was history. And it's hard to see, how could he not have gotten interested? Other kids went to Disney World. I went to Antietam and to Gettysburg and Vicksburg and eventually here to Franklin. And I think that's the trip that really started it all. And finished up both of my degrees in school. I got my bachelor's and my master's in history, and then I moved here to Tennessee in 2021 and started working at the Battle of Franklin Trust, and been living and loving every minute of it.
Excellent. Wow. Brilliant. Okay, mate, let's talk about, again, obviously, we're going to be talking about the Battle of Franklin because it is the 160th anniversary of those events. Okay, so John Bell Hood. Give us a little bit of background on him.
So Hood's born in Kentucky, 1831, I think, Owensville, Kentucky, and pre-war Army officer, graduated from West Point, class 1853. Graduates, 40 or 50, 47th out of a class of 53. Yeah, 47th out of a class of 53. But people always hold that over him and go, "Oh my God, you believe graduates so low in his class." The class started with like 120 cadets, so he actually graduates about average. Nevertheless, Hood has a pretty uneventful pre-war career. 1861, he resigns his U.S. Army commission and becomes a cavalry officer in the Northern District of Virginia. Very, very quickly thereafter, becomes an infantry commander and takes over command of the 4th Texas Infantry. Fights under Lee throughout the first really 2 years of the war that he's involved in the Eastern Theater, so 62 into the better part of 63. And of course, he's wounded. Second day of the Battle of Gettysburg, cannon shell explodes, rains down shrapnel that breaks about 2 inches of the radial bone in his left arm, recovers. Back in the fight on September the 20th, 1863, the Battle of Chickamauga, wounded a second time, gunshot wound to his upper right thigh, and then recovers. 8 weeks later, he's in the saddle learning how to ride a horse again. He's off of pain medication. Christmas of 1863, he's given an examination that deems him fit to return to field command. Arrives in the spring of 1864 to take command of a corps in the Army of Tennessee. And then fights with Joe Johnston and Leonidas Polk and William Hardee through the early phases of the Atlanta campaign. And then, of course, on July 17th, 1864, with about 12 miles between the Army and the city of Atlanta, Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, fires Joe Johnston and puts Hood in place as the new commander of the Army. Comes out swinging, fighting in and around Atlanta, but ultimately sort of inherits a bad situation. So by September the 1st, he's forced to abandon the city. And within the next day, General William Tecumseh Sherman and his federal armies march into Atlanta, and Hood marches to the south and then begins moving his army out of Georgia and into Alabama and north towards Tennessee.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so Hood's plan then after Atlanta is to lure William T. Sherman into battle, isn't it? So just talk us about through his tactics there on trying to draw Sherman out of Atlanta and into a pitched battle.
Well, I mean, it's a good idea on paper. The problem is that Sherman really has no interest in fighting with Hood. His intention is to turn and march the army down through Georgia and towards Savannah ultimately. So as Hood swings south of Atlanta, what he starts to do by the 30th of September is he gathers together this plan to swing the army back north. Of course, they'll fight at all of the same places where they had been beforehand. You know, Allatoona, Resaca, Dalton, all of the places where Hood had been with the army as they had come out of Tennessee the first time, or out of Tennessee and into Northwest Georgia the first time. Now they're basically repeating in the reverse way. But as Hood goes north of Atlanta, his intention is to try and damage Sherman's supply lines and force Sherman out of the city of Atlanta. And if he's lucky, what Hood does is gets Sherman's army out of Atlanta, commits him into a full scale battle. And if he's successful, he can move back in and reoccupy the city of Atlanta, which, I mean, if we're just going to be honest, with 160 years of hindsight, it's easy to look at some of these things and just call it crazy or call it, desperate. And I think this completely suits the idea of desperate. But then one of the great sort of criticisms of Hood that comes out of this is that he didn't do enough to try and destroy Sherman's supply lines or anything. Well, that's countered by the fact that Sherman's not going to use his supply lines. So then Hood has to come up with what the best, next best plan for his army would be, and that's to get out of Georgia and into Alabama.
Okay, so for that task, Sherman is obviously going, like you said, Sherman's concentrating on the march to the sea at that point and going through the rest of Georgia. But he puts in place Major General George H. Thomas, doesn't he? So just give us a little background on Thomas and how he ends up in charge of the Army of the Cumberland.
Yep, Thomas, like Sherman, like Hood, all West Pointers. But Thomas gets to Nashville in October of 1864, and Thomas, of course, had commanded the Army of the Cumberland through much of the war since William Rosecrans's departure in '63. But Thomas is old reliable in a lot of ways. Pat Thomas, Slow Trot, all these great nicknames that come along with him. But Thomas gets to Nashville, inherits a pretty beleaguered command. He's got about 10,000 men under his command, the majority of whom are cavalrymen. And some of those cavalrymen have just lost their mounts as their horses have been sent further south to support the march and to support Judson Kilpatrick and his cavalry corps. So Thomas gets to Nashville, and this is not anything new for him to be placed in a pretty serious, pretty desperate situation. As he starts moving himself naturally into as Thomas starts moving into Nashville, he's one of the most respected officers in the Federal Army, in the United States Army by this phase of the war. This is a man who had effectively saved the Federal Army both at Stones River and then later at Chickamauga in September of '63. So the Rock of Chickamauga gets to Nashville, and he's got this sort of beleaguered command, starts to put out the word for troops, though, to move from East Tennessee, from West Tennessee. And so while those men are on their way to him, Sherman also dispatches some 28,000 men under the command of General John M. Schofield. And it'll be a unified effort between Thomas and Schofield to try and delay Hood and fight him off as he makes his way into Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And yes, so I'd like to know the road to. You pretty much explained how George Thomas and the Army of the Cumberland sort of gets to Franklin, but can you tell us a little bit about how both armies end up in Franklin itself and why they end up there?
Yeah, so Thomas has got the call, right? And Sherman sends back the 23rd Corps of the Army of the Ohio and the 4th Corps of the Army of the Cumberland, and they're both placed under the command of Schofield. And the 4th Corps is in Chattanooga, Tennessee, which on this map is a little bit further south and east of what we can see Tullahoma If you just keep going straight down the page there, you'll run right into Chattanooga. Um, the Fourth Corps is there, and so they'll start to make their way towards Pulaski. The 23rd Corps will start to make their way towards Pulaski, and Schofield is going to actually bring his army together there. Now, same time frame, there's cavalry movements afoot. November 14th, 1864, Nathan Bedford Forrest arrives to take command of the Confederate Cavalry Corps in the Army of Tennessee. Same sort of time frame, first 2 weeks in November. Also arriving in the Western Theater for the first time is General James Harrison Wilson. James Wilson, of course, kind of renowned for what he does in the Overland Campaign. He's remembered there. Was sort of a negative opinion, but comes west, and like most Eastern federal soldiers that end up in the Western Theater, somehow he just turns it around. But these two cavalry corps commanders will be dueling effectively from the Tennessee River north towards Columbia. Hood's army moves out of Georgia, crosses and initially had intended to strike at Decatur, bypasses Decatur, and then moves towards Tuscumbia. And it's there that he's really stuck for a little bit more than a week, waiting on supplies to catch up, food, ammunition, things that his army is going to need to sustain themselves in the field. Finally, on November the 21st of 64, Hood crosses over the Tennessee River, and with three corps begins this kind of three-headed approach, three-pronged approach. Cheatham furthest to the west, Stephen D. Lee in the center, and then, of course, out on the far right flank is General A.P. Stewart's corps. And they'll begin their movement up towards Lawrenceburg, then from Lawrenceburg north and kind of easterly towards Mount Pleasant. And then it's a foot race on November the 24th when Schofield learns that Hood's actually got probably a day's march on him towards Columbia. Schofield starts moving north, and what he had done in Pulaski is actually really kind of brilliant. He gets into town, fortifies on the north side of the river, fortifies on the north side of the town, and he gets along Pigeon Roost Creek, and he kind of tucks himself into a series of hills. And he effectively just waits for Hood to move in his direction. But by the 24th, gets the army moving out of Pulaski north towards Columbia. Both armies arrive there on the 26th of November, and there breaks out 2 days of fighting in Columbia, 26th through the 28th. By the 29th, Hood starts his movement north towards Spring Hill. And then, of course, by the 30th, they're in Franklin.
Mm-hmm. And I noticed you mentioned the Battle of Spring Hill there. So just tell us a little bit about the Battle of Spring Hill. Is it a full pitch battle? Or is it more like a skirmish?
Well, the men who fought there certainly thought it was a battle, and I certainly think it's a battle. So it's probably the most consequential fight that Hood and the Federal Army that Schofield commands will run into throughout this entire campaign. It's the one that opens up the door to Franklin and Nashville. Without Spring Hill, that was supposed to be it. That was supposed to be the decisive battle. This was the finishing stroke for Hood's campaign into Tennessee. So on the evening of the 27th of November, Hood called his corps commanders together, Stephen D. Lee, A.P. Stewart, Benjamin Cheatham, and his cavalry corps commander, Nathan Bedford Forrest, to a council of war. And as they start to come up with a plan, Hood decides what he's going to do in Columbia is leave behind Lee and close to 10,000 men of his corps while moving 20,000 soldiers under Cheatham and Stewart to the east of Columbia, marching across the Davis Ford on the Duck River, and then moving 12 miles behind Schofield's lines to the town of Spring Hill along the Davis Ford Road. Once the men are in position, the Confederate Army, Cheatham and Stewart's corps, will block the Columbia Turnpike while Schofield remains still down in Spring Hill, down in Columbia, drawn towards the south side of the river, and sort of stuck on whatever Stephen D. Lee and his artillery bombardment of some 36 hours might do. So Schofield's supposed to be distracted. Meanwhile, the two corps march behind Schofield's lines. And then on the morning of November the 30th, Hood thinks that's it. What he'll do is he'll mount up on his horse and ride out to the Columbia Turnpike. And there on the morning of the 30th of November, he would have found John Schofield's army either ready to commit to a battle from two fronts or ready to surrender. And of course, Confederate plan at Spring Hill seems to fall apart. On the 28th of November, long before the Confederate Army really starts moving, on the 28th of November, Schofield cuts the pontoons and burns the bridges across the Duck River, effectively leaving Hood stranded on the south side. But on the morning of the 29th, Hood's plan's already in motion. Early morning hours, Nathan Bedford Forrest cavalry will start to move up the Lewisburg Turnpike, effectively pushing James Wilson and his cavalry further north and east of Spring Hill and north and east of the main Confederate body's march route. And then throughout the day on the 29th, Confederate infantry closes towards Spring Hill. But interestingly, Colonel Philip Sidney Post, who commands one of the brigades in Schofield's army, Post conducted an infantry reconnaissance of the Duck River. And what he saw was, as he reported, heavy columns of infantry moving north. Makes that report back to John Schofield, and early that morning, around 10 or so, Schofield starts the evacuation of his army out of Columbia. Guns and wagons first, followed by infantry. So it gets the report around 8, probably moving within the hour. 800 wagons, 50 pieces of artillery moving north along the Columbia Turnpike. Now, keep in mind, Schofield doesn't have a cavalry corps necessarily to escort his guns and wagons. What he's relying upon is an infantry division, 2 of them, primarily one under the command of Brigadier General Nathan Kimball, and then another division under the command of Brigadier General George Wagner. Wagner's men, of course, will get into Spring Hill, fortify on the northeast and later towards the south side of town. But no sooner does Colonel John Lane's brigade arrive in Spring Hill than does Forrest cavalry show up from the Mount Carmel Turnpike out near, coming in from Mount Carmel west towards Spring Hill. And a short fight breaks out between the Confederate cavalry and the infantry brigade under John Lane. And I always kind of like to point this out. John Lane had been on the job for about 6 hours. This is really his first time commanding a brigade in full-scale combat. And John Lane beats up on Nathan Bedford Forrest and sends Forrest in retreat back down the Rally Hill Pike towards the home of Marion and St. Clair Caldwell. That's where he's going to make his headquarters throughout much of the rest of the day and into that night. Simultaneously, Confederate Army still moving, and by around 3 or so that afternoon, arrive on the south side of town. By 4, Benjamin Cheatham and John Bell Hood commit the army to an assault here at Spring Hill, or do they? In a sense, it seems as though they're only moving towards the Columbia Turnpike. They're just moving to block the road, and all of a sudden, Cleburne's division runs right into Brigadier General Luther Bradley's brigade. And there breaks out probably 45 or so minutes of fighting, 45 very difficult minutes of fighting, in which almost 700 men are killed, wounded, captured, and missing between both sides. Bradley's line breaks. Cleburne rushes towards Spring Hill and towards the road. As General Daniel Govan said, we were a 20 minutes march from the road. But then as the sun sets, the situation becomes incredibly confused, and the attack at Spring Hill ultimately stalls. Confederate Army never gets to the road. And around 3 o'clock on the afternoon of the 29th, John Schofield ordered the evacuation of his army out of Columbia, and now it's just the infantry to move. And that night, Schofield will conduct what I would argue is the most incredible, most daring escape in the history of the United States Army. He puts some 28,000 men, 800 wagons, and 50 pieces of artillery right past the Confederates in the middle of the night. And they arrive in Franklin around 4 in the morning.
Wow, awesome. Yeah, thanks for explaining that. Yes, so how many people were actually involved in this Battle of Spring Hill then?
So you've got almost all of Forrest Cavalry Corps, so Chalmers and Jackson's divisions, as well as Buford's division. So there's easily close to 4,000 or 5,000 cavalrymen there. You've got Cleburne's division, a little bit more than 3,000 men. And then Wagner's division's about 5,700 men, plus all the guns of the 4th Corps. So you're looking about 20,000, I would imagine.
Okay, yeah,
sort of involved.
Quite a big battle then. I didn't really, it's great learning about some of this stuff because I wasn't too familiar with this particular battle. So thanks for clearing some of that up for us. But we do get to November the 30th, 1864, and the Battle of Franklin. And so the Union commanders of the day are here on the screen. Um, yeah, so tell us the plan for the Union at this point, and what is their plan?
So George Thomas is not here. He's up in Nashville. He's far, far off and away. So the field commander, the man in the field making decisions, is John Schofield. And Schofield reaches Spring Hill on the evening of the 30th or the evening of the 29th, and makes his intention known that he plans to march the army on to Franklin. Now he gets to Franklin, gets into town around 4 in the morning, and the town of Franklin is bordered northeast and slightly to the west by the Harpeth River, which is not a very wide river. It's not a very deep river. No worries of gunboats or any of that stuff. The problem with the Harpeth is that a flood just about 2 weeks earlier had washed out the county bridge and the footbridge, leaving behind barely a passable way over the Harpeth. So Schofield gets to town, realizes that he's stuck, and turns his Corps of Engineers loose on constructing a new roadbed on top of the Nashville and Decatur Railway trestle. And at the same time, there's an effort underway to rebuild a portion of the County Road Bridge so that there are two passageways for the Army to escape on. Same time frame, around 4:30 in the morning, General Jacob Cox, 36 years old, Brewer, Ohio congressman, theologian, abolitionist society member before the war, he arrived at the house of Fountain Branch Carter on the south side of Franklin, and informed the Carters he was going to use a portion of their home as his temporary headquarters. Gets into the house, rests for about 20 minutes. Of course, there's some understanding that there's a conversation between Cox and Fountain Branch Carter. And Carter effectively asks him, "Are we in danger? Is there going to be a fight here? What should we do?" And to Cox's knowledge, the Army's intention, and I think this is reflective of what the Army, the entire Army, thinks throughout the day, there is no plan for them to stay in Franklin. They're going to march straight out of town, north on to Nashville, and be in Nashville by the end of the day. So Cox tells them, we don't anticipate any combat, and they go really throughout their day as normal. Cox gets into the house though, and he's probably there sleeping for 20 minutes before Schofield tells him, "You're in command of the Army." And I think Cox is probably one of the most honest recorders of what he remembers from the fighting. And he said, "In my intimate connection with the man, I had never seen him so disturbed or so distressed." He knows, as Schofield knows, that he is stuck in a very, very dangerous situation here. And all the while, Schofield's getting messages from Thomas that say things like, "I think you should hold in Franklin for 3 days." And Schofield, surveying the situation, realizing how desperate an attempt to hold there would be, responds to Thomas, I do not think I will hold for scarcely 24 hours. But Cox gets command of the Army, heads south of town, literally 75 yards south of the Carter farm, and starts to place federal troops along Carter Hill. And that line runs from the east side of the Columbia Turnpike back towards the east side of the Harpeth River, and from the west side of the Columbia Turnpike back towards, naturally, the west side of the Harpeth River. David Stanley and the Fourth Corps start to arrive. Schofield has his entire army really assembled for the first time. James Wilson and his cavalry is there. Cox and his infantry corps, really Schofield's infantry corps, and Stanley's corps. All of them for the first time able to fight cohesively as an army formation in Franklin. So they'll get into town, start to fortify, construct 3-foot, 4-foot high earthen embankments on the south side of town, earthen entrenchments on the south side of town. Some 36 pieces of artillery are put onto the line. 16 guns are right near the Carter farm, so a massive artillery in the center, the rest of the guns flanking out to each side. But a lot of men in maneuver throughout the morning, and still more guns and wagons to arrive throughout the afternoon. So guns and wagons and more men will be following up from Spring Hill throughout the day.
Excellent. Okay, and so what about the Confederates? How do they set up, and what is their plan to break or to engage with the Union Army?
Well, on the morning of the 30th, Hood very likely met with General Benjamin Cheatham and realized what had unfolded. Even at 2 o'clock in the morning, he gets a message from Stephen D. Lee that says that at present there's no enemy to my front in Columbia. So at daybreak, he gets the army moving. A.P. Stewart's corps starts to move up the Lewisburg Turnpike. Fourth Cavalry is already on the move up Columbia, Lewisburg, and Carter's Creek Pike. And then Benjamin Cheatham's corps starts moving north on the Columbia Turnpike, north towards Franklin. By around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Hood arrived on the south side of town, and what he could see effectively were three layers of federal defenses. There's a skirmish line out front, probably about 1,000 or so men. Right behind them, near Privet Knob, before they fell back to their last position, a half-mile south of the main line, was General George Wagner's division, forming an advanced federal line with one brigade, Colonel John Lanes, deployed forward with an artillery battery and two other brigades right behind it under Colonel Emerson Updike and Joseph Conrad. And then finally, he could see the main line, very likely see the main line, bristling with 36 guns and some 20,000 men behind it. Hood looked at all of this and came up with a plan, which was simply to attack. And I think one of the great misconceptions is that Hood had another option. People will always throw, well, Forrest told him to go around to the flanks and cross over the Harpeth River and attack them from both sides. Well, there's just not enough time. There's not enough time left in the day to get the men in position to do that. There's also not enough daylight left for those men to be able to move into those positions. Hood ultimately, though, is faced with the decision to attack, and while not an easy one, it is the only opportunity, the only chance that he has at victory. And this is not about winning a trophy for second place. For Hood, this is the fight to win. He needs to win. He must win here. He must win now. So Hood gets back to his temporary headquarters at the Harrison House and meets with his corps commanders and tells them effectively the plan is that they'll attack the federal position here at Franklin. And between 1 o'clock and 4 o'clock, he gets 20,000 men, 6 divisions strong from 2 corps, Stewart and Cheatham, into position to assault the federal positions here at Franklin, the federal defenses here at Franklin. Stephen D. Lee's corps will be absent from the fight. They won't make it up to Franklin by 4 o'clock, so they will simply have to make their march from Spring Hill to Franklin on their own, and if possible, be committed to the assault. We'll talk about that, I'm sure. But 6 divisions, Loring, Walthall, French, Claiborne, Brown, Bate, eventually Ed Johnson's division will be brought up that night. But 6 divisions are in position by 4 o'clock that afternoon. And at 4, the signal's given and the attack begins. And sweeping up from the south side of Franklin go 20,000 Confederate soldiers right towards the main federal line. And of course, out front is George Wagner's division. Lane and Conrad's brigades deployed to front. Colonel Emerson Opdyke's brigade held in reserve back to the north side of the Carter House and north side of the federal defensive line. Hood starts moving, and all of a sudden, Joseph Conrad can see the Confederate attack maneuvering towards him, sends back a message to Wagner. Wagner responds, never mind that, stand there and fight them. And no sooner do the Confederate troops close on Conrad's position than do they finally get word to fall back, but now it's just simply too late. A lot of criticisms for why Wagner's deployed out front, why they're stuck out there. Easiest way to explain it, nobody else can see what Wagner's division can see. They're in a position to be able to look from this kind of wedge-shaped plain on the south side of town south towards the Merrill House at Privet Knob, if not just a little bit further to the base of Winstead Hill. They can see that area as you come down Winstead and down to this low ground. So they're in a good spot. The problem is not that they're there, it's that they're there for a moment too long. And they just get caught up in the sort of the rush of the attack. Now what happens is Hood had planned for the entire army to go in all at once. So it would be 6 divisions hitting the works at the exact same time. The problem is that the right side of the Confederate line, so Loring and Walthall's division, and to some extent French's division, end up hitting just a little bit before the rest of the army. And that's largely because of what happens in the center with Cleburne and Brown's divisions running into Wagner out front. So Cockrell's brigade, for instance, is simply ripped to pieces out of French's division. Smallest unit that I can think of on the field, 696 men under Francis Cockrell's command. And in the advance and in the ensuing battle, he loses 417. He himself, Francis Cockrell, severely wounded, taken off the field. Most of his commanders killed or wounded. Featherston and Scott's brigades of Loring's divisions ripped to pieces as they approached the Federal artillery batteries near Stiles and Casement's brigades on the left side of the Federal line. Walthal's division similarly gunned down, ripped to pieces as they approach out of the railroad cut. Cleburne's division, once they finally break through Wagner's line and rush towards the center, and now it's on. The assault is on. They're shouting, "Rally to the rear, retreat, run for your lives!" And the Confederates, as they come in right behind them, are shouting, "Go into the works with them!" And Cleburne's division closes towards the center. Cleburne himself, probably somewhere in between Granberry, Govan, and Lowry's brigades. And that's when he's shot not further south, maybe than 150 yards or so from the earthworks. He's close to 50 yards away from the road and 100 yards south of the line when he falls. So Cleburne's dead. His next in command, Hiram Granberry, he's dead. Across the street, George Washington Gordon's taken prisoner. Otho Strahl will end up spending much of the evening pinned down outside the earthworks. But what happens is as Cleburne's division hits the center, it breaks a hole right through the center of the Federal line where the 100th Ohio and the 1st Kentucky Battery was. And as the 100th Ohio kind of peels away and rushes back, the 104th turns into that area near the Cotton Gin and sort of braces themselves around the guns of the 6th Ohio Battery. Meanwhile, across the road, the line continues to tear open. 50th Ohio, 72nd Illinois, forced to abandon their position on the earthworks. And really now the weight is falling on some brand new troops of the 44th Missouri, 175th Ohio, General James Riley's reserves, 16th Kentucky, 12th Kentucky, and the 8th Tennessee U.S. All of those men be thrown into the fight. On the other side of the road, green troops of the 44th Missouri hanging on for dear life. And then just a little bit further to the west, William Bates' division strikes the earthworks near the kind of far right flank of Ruger's division. And when he hits Moore's brigade, he just sort of tears a hole right into that. But they're thrown back in relative haste. Moore's men hold their section of the line. Bate is just simply not able to quite break that section. And we see a lot of kind of hand-to-hand fighting all across the center near the Gin, from the Gin down towards the Orchard as well.
Excellent, thank you. So it's quite a bloody affair then, this the Battle of Franklin.
Absolutely, yeah. It's it would be wrong to characterize it as anything, saying, "Oh, it's the bloodiest, this, that, or the other thing of the Civil War." But I mean, it's hell on earth for about 5 hours for the men who are here. And there's been a lot of misconceptions. People say, "Well, it was really just an infantryman's fight." Well, say that to the artillerymen that are fighting tooth and nail to hold onto their guns and discharge double and triple canister into the ranks of the advancing Confederates. So this is really an everyman effort across the entire Federal line to hold on, and they buy enough time ultimately for the reserve brigade from Wagner's division, that of Colonel Emerson Opdyke, to come forward. And Opdyke leads forward a demi brigade, so it's a really large brigade, 6 regiments, charge the works, 6.5 technically regiments, charge the works, and they hit all of the weak spots in the line and sort of reinforce it. And it's enough to throw the Confederate attack back down to the Federal line, main Federal line. And it'll be out there that Strahl will fight with his men, and some soldiers recall him loading and firing rifles with his men down in the Carter's garden, the vegetable garden near their orchard. States Rights Gist and John Carpenter Carter, 2 brigadier generals, would both fall. One severely wounded and would die on the 10th. And of course, Gist is killed there the day of the fight. Back across the road near the Cotton Gin, John Adams's brigade comes on the line. Adams, of course, is shot out of the saddle, hit multiple times, and he is killed. Um, so there's the five, technically six generals killed at Franklin right there.
Wow. And so what is the point where Hood realizes this is not gonna, not gonna work for him and the army of
Well, funny you bring that up. At 7 o'clock, he's got another division to throw into the assault, and it's that under the Commander General Ed Johnson. Johnson's division was part of SD Lee's corps. They had arrived up first from Spring Hill, and Johnson is thrown into the assault. And the expectation, the order, is for Johnson to strike the center, which means follow right where Claiborne and Brown hit and hit the middle of the Federal line. The problem is it's dark. The situation is very confused. The guides that are being used to bring the army forward aren't necessarily maybe cognizant of where they're leading a portion of this division to hit. And Johnson, instead of hitting the center, actually follows more in line with the left portion of Brown's division, the right portion of Bates' division, and strikes a section of Colonel Silas Strickland's brigade, a portion of Thomas Ruger's division. And the men of Johnson's division probably fight for about 25, 30 minutes. They take almost 300 casualties, killed, wounded, captured, and missing. Johnson will see all four of his brigade commanders severely wounded and taken from the field, and his division is repulsed. Even at midnight, as the Federal Army is evacuating and moving north, even at midnight, Hood calls together a council of war and brings together his corps commanders yet again, this time Stephen D. Lee present, and gives them the word that he expects an attack at daybreak in the morning. So they're going to bring all the artillery up. They're going to bring all the men up. And then all three corps will assault the Federal position after an hour-long artillery bombardment. And of course, by sunup, it's revealed that the Federal Army is no longer here. The bridges across the Harpeth River were constructed, probably ready. A good early estimate says 6 o'clock that evening on the 30th. And as Schofield has no intention to stay in Franklin, he starts moving north and begins the evacuation of his army all throughout the night. And by early morning, by 6 in the morning, there are no Federal soldiers left on the north or south side of the Harpeth River. And Schofield starts moving north towards Nashville. He arrives there midday on the 1st. Meanwhile, the Confederate Army, they start to stir that morning, and as the sun does come up, they see what had unfolded. In about 5 hours of combat, there'd been close to 10,000 men killed, wounded, captured, and missing.
Wow. Okay. So is it seen as a Union victory then, this one?
It should be. It should absolutely be. I mean, if we're just looking at just objectives, right? The tactical objective, of course, is to defeat your opponent and try and destroy Hood's army. Well, I think you could say that Schofield's army did a pretty handed job, so we'll give them the tactical victory. What's the strategic one? What's the ultimate goal here is to get to Nashville and fortify there with the rest of Thomas's troops. And of course, Schofield gets to that. So we'll give him both the tactical and the strategic victory point. Now, what about Hood? What has he got? Well, he holds the ground. That's what a lot of people say. They say, well, they took back Franklin. All right, well, that wasn't really the objective. Hood's entire plan had been to destroy Schofield's army and march on Nashville unopposed. So to call it anything other than an absolute total victory for the U.S. Army here in Franklin is just false.
Excellent. Thanks, mate. What I would love to know is, and again, I mean, people that live in this area at this time are probably used to the armies coming and going, but what is it like for the people of Franklin, the people of Nashville and the surrounding areas with these armies constantly in contact with each other?
Well, Franklin had been under federal occupation for much of the war since April of the previous spring. So this is an army or a town that has been under federal occupation for almost a year. They're used to seeing federal troops in the area. They're used to having fights here. There had been one in April of 1863. There had been some cavalry skirmishes and such. But then on the morning of the 1st of December, they see this scene that's kind of in front of us now is just the dead as far as the eye can see. And this is a town of some 800 or so residents that has to figure out what to do with 7,000 wounded men. Places like Carnton, where I'm actually sitting right now, I'm in my office here. Um, a place like Carnton becomes one of the largest Confederate field hospital in Franklin. Um, Close to 600 men will be treated in and around the house over the coming days, weeks, and into the next few months. The town of Franklin itself sees just about any standing building that can be used as a hospital turned into a hospital. Um, and we start to watch as this civilian populace is yet again thrust into the kind of the hardships of war.
Mhm. And I think that's forgotten about quite often. And also, people don't. I don't think people think about the aftermath of a battle, and it must have been
Yeah.
horrendous scenes.
I mean, if you
Um,
really think about the true personal kind of attachment to this is, well, there's the Carter farm, right? Fountain Branch and his family had lived there since he had shown up there in 1829 and bought the 19 acres of land that it sits on. He had buried his wife in 1852, and but they had had a family before then, 12 children. Um, Seven of them would live to see the end of the American Civil War, and one of the sons is a 24-year-old captain in the 20th Tennessee. His name's Todd Carter. He's on Brigadier General Thomas Benton Smith's staff. And I think a lot of people, they'll focus on Todd because I think he's the soldier and all that stuff, right? I tend to try and think about Fountain Branch Carter. And this is a man who, 67 years old, limps out onto the battlefield the next morning, and he gets word that his son is on the battlefield. And he starts looking for Todd, and he finds him at the base of the hill, not far from the house that he had grown up in. And as Moscow Carter, the oldest surviving son, remembered, said that his father didn't leave Todd's side for scarcely 36 hours. He simply sat in the room across from the one in which Todd was born in and watched him die. And then 2 days later, a day later, Fountain Branch Carter got to do something that 2,500 other fathers at the Battle of Franklin don't get to do, and that's bury their son. So Fountain Branch and family members take Todd's body over to the Rest Haven Cemetery. It's interred there today. Um, but I think that's one of the often overlooked aspects is that there are people in this town, Williamson County, Tennessee, furnishes regiments to go off and fight in the Confederate Army. And there are men who are fighting in their hometown, many of them dying in their hometown, right here.
wow. Okay. And so, what is the reaction like from Washington and Richmond when they hear about the Union victory here?
Well, Washington, there's not much great celebration going on. Naturally, there's the understanding that Hood's army was beaten up here in Franklin, but really everyone's eyes immediately then shift to Nashville. Because if Schofield had just beaten up on Hood's army, now is the time for Thomas to get out and strike. And in Richmond, there will be quiet for the next several days into the next 2 weeks because effectively Hood's army is now moved north towards Nashville and circled the south side of town, entrenched on the south side of town. Meanwhile, in Nashville, federal troops continue to flow into the city. And as the weather starts to worsen, it seems as though the messages from Washington become a little bit more frequently, trying to urge Thomas to get out and fight. But what's happened is the weather has soured. There is ice and snow that is blanketed the ground. It's freezing conditions outside. And much of the area south of Nashville is really rugged and hilly terrain. And Thomas understands that he can't actually attack. His men will just slip and slide into slaughter if he does that. So he has to wait. Even as late as December the 14th, there is a plan underway to replace George Thomas. Either Grant threatens to come personally or General John Logan. But Logan is turned around when he gets to Louisville, Kentucky, and learns that on the 15th of December, George Thomas had come out of the city's defenses with about 60,000 men. We'll be a little bit more generous to Hood, call it 57,000 or so. And Thomas's troops come out of the city's defenses, just pummel Hood's army. And that Hood's Army of Tennessee holds on through the first day is kind of impressive. But that they're still there on the 16th is something of note. Afternoon of the 16th, the army finally just disintegrates, and Hood's army begins to retreat back down the Franklin Road. By the 17th, they're back in Franklin. By the 18th, they're back across the Duck River. 10 days later, back across the Tennessee River. And it's really once Hood gets towards Tupelo, Mississippi, that he starts making messages to Richmond, but also to his department commander, General P.G.T. Beauregard, that he needs to meet with Beauregard. He needs to meet with War Department officials. He needs Beauregard to come and inspect the army. And then ultimately, he tenders his resignation, which is approved on January 23rd, 1865. And of course, we know the war just lasts another, 3 months. But Hood resigns his command and makes his way back to Richmond, and there he files his report of the campaign. So there's a lot of sort of gray area in what the reaction is in the Confederate capital and in the U.S. capital, and that's largely because there's still a lot of fighting to be done in those days immediately following Franklin.
Excellent. Yeah, I'd love to ask what your thoughts are on Thomas's and Hood's generalship and how they perform as army commanders.
I mean, it's hard to find anything to really criticize Thomas for. Um, I think he is perfect at gathering up his army and sort of building up a defensive force to use against Hood. Now, there's a lot of places that you can criticize Hood's generalship, but it's not the old tropes. He's not dumb, he's not ignorant, he's not a drug addict, he's none of those things. Hood, in fact, was a good soldier. But I think the criticism of Hood is also one of the Army of Tennessee. He's trying to do too much with far too little by this phase of the war. This is an army that has proven itself on battlefield after battlefield and has continued to get knocked down, but keeps getting right back up and back into the fight. And Hood takes this army on the offensive, gets into Tennessee, and I think right up until the afternoon of the 29th of November, conducts a very well laid out and very well executed campaign. There had been some setbacks, right? Of course, having to bypass Decatur, not getting the supplies from Tuscumbia to the army quick enough. There had been issues along the way, but once the fighting starts, it's hard to find fault with Hood's decision-making process. And I guess the biggest criticism would be, like I said, trying to do too much with too little.
Mm-hmm. Totally agree. Okay, let's talk about something really, really important, and that is the preservation of the battlefield. Now, just give us a little bit of an idea of the Battle of Franklin Trust and how that came about, please.
So the Battle of Franklin Trust is actually the result of a merger in 2009 between the Carter House Association and Carnton Association, merging the two battlefield sites here in town together under one entity, one umbrella. But the BOFT, the Battle of Franklin Trust, has been here since 2009, but been involved in battlefield preservation and reclamation even before it was chartered. So one of the earliest sort of attempts at reclamation, of course, was made by the veterans themselves and the people in town. They tried about a dozen times to try and save the battlefield, ultimately always failing in the kind of final steps in committees in Washington, D.C., never really quite able to make it into a national military park, like the Gettysburgs, like the Vicksburgs, like the Antietam's, the later systems, right? But in 2004, and you could argue too that some of the effort really began with the saving of Fort Negley back in the 1970s and 1980s. But in 2004, the Franklin golf course was open. The Pizza Hut was still open. The area that you see here on the map in front of you was still inundated with buildings. There was a Domino's, a strip mall, a Pizza Hut naturally on the other side of the street. Several houses, private properties across the land. A whole house across the road next to the Carter House was a Franklin Flower Shop, another private residence, a pottery shop. And not to mention the Franklin High School Gymnasium. So it's taken about 20 or so years, if not a little bit more, and millions, tens of millions of dollars to reclaim sort of 20 acres right around Carter House and about another 100 acres over near Carnton. All of that together makes up preserved sections of the Franklin battlefield now. And while it would have been great, I suppose, to see a mock-up building of the gin or the cotton screw press, those things will probably not happen. But that the land has been saved and that the money that has been raised has gone in towards saving other pieces of the battlefield. Here in just a few weeks, we'll have some big announcements, some big battlefield reclamation announcements about properties immediately south of the Carter farm. That for the first time, we'll have a view shed that hasn't been seen really since the 1890s, being able to see from the Carter house all the way down towards Everbright Avenue or Everbright Street today, where Rebecca Bostick lived. And we can see a whole section of the battlefield being opened up, much in the same way that when the Domino's and the Pizza Hut and the strip mall and all of that stuff was removed, it opened up the other side of the pike. Now we're moving to the other side of the road, and we'll save some pieces of ground there too.
Okay, cool. And you work with the trust, don't you? So what is your role for the trust?
So I'm currently the historian for the Battle of Franklin Trust, and I have been in that role for the last year. But I've worked for the BOFT for 3 years as a historical interpreter for most of my time here, and then for the last year as the historian.
Okay, so what about visiting the battlefield itself, how accessible is it, and what do people have to do?
So you can go on our website, boft.org/visit, and you can plan your entire trip. You can even book some tickets online, but it really is just as easy as showing up at 1345 Eastern Flank Circle to visit Carnton. Visit our visitor center here, check in, purchase your tickets, and they'll put you on a tour. And we offer hour-long guided tours of the historic home here at Carnton, which focus on the family, the McGavicks, their life here before, during, and after the war, and as well as about the battle and how it impacts them. And then we've also got battlefield tours that are available Monday through Saturday, 9, 11, and 2, every day of the week except Sunday. You can get on the Franklin battlefield. You can do some self-guided stuff for free around the battlefields as well. Those are on city park and state preserved areas that you're able to just get out and kind of see for yourself. But the State Historic site at Carter House, very much the same way. Visit at 1140 Columbia Avenue, the Folk Street Visitor Center there, and purchase your tickets. And some big and exciting news. Here in January, we expect to break ground on a brand new visitor center at the Carter House. It'll be an incredible sort of addition to the work that's gone on here for the last 20 and 30 years.
Okay. And aside from being the historian there at the trust, you also run or you do a podcast for them as well. So tell us a little bit about that.
So I've hosted the Dispatch for the last year and a half, 2 years. Actually stepped away from that role last year as we sort of decided to bring the Dispatch to its end. So the podcast itself no longer airs, but you can listen to the kind of backlog of episodes. But in addition to the Dispatch, I also host my own podcast, Brew History podcast, which is not affiliated with any of the sites or anything like that. It's just something I started while I was in school. And I still have that going. But the Dispatch is everything from tour guide talks to chalkboard histories, and then homebrew history is a whole run and gamut of anything that we want to talk about. We do history, pop culture, and brews. I mean, it's right there in the bio.
Excellent. And so your getaway from Franklin is you're quite a big World War II fan. Is that correct?
Yes, that's very true. I'll be back your way in September, hopefully, for another round of We Have Ways Festival.
Nice, excellent. Well, I hope I'll come and see you there. But yeah, so you did have a trip over this year, didn't you? So just tell us a little bit about that. And you had a baby with you, didn't you, at the time as well? Which
sure did. So some would say brave, others would say stupid. But my wife and I brought, at the time, our 7-month-old with us to attend the We Have Ways of Making You Talk. We have Ways Fest, hosted by James Holland and Al Murray. And I spoke there actually about the Civil War and its connections to World War II, and how there are so many great parallels, and sort of start with the basic stuff. They had a general named Sherman, a tank named Sherman, but then get into some of the more things about ideology and understanding what these wars were. One was a war to save a republic, and the other one was a war to save democracy and free peoples around the world. So it's great ties between the two, but we got a chance to see kind of everything. We hit various spots all around England, went down really primarily in the south, down to Wiltshire and Salisbury, and hit a lot of great World War II sites and saw some ancient things as well, which was just fantastic, and had a great time and look to do it again here in just a couple months.
Excellent. Yeah. And you'll have to come down my end of the country, down to the southeast area. Some great stuff down here. But yeah, so if people want to listen to your podcast or get involved with the Battle of Franklin Trust, how do they go about that?
So to get involved with the BOFT, just go to boft.org, and there's a membership tab on there, and support and donate links there. You want to help with battlefield preservation, never say no to that. Or if you have something else in mind, you want to help us with the Enslaved Project, which will represent in sort of a physical form 44 of the enslaved here at Carnton, eventually the 28 at Carter House, and the 75 men, women, and children at Ripavilla. You want to donate towards that, or to the memorialization effort of that, or to the continued battlefield maintenance and upkeep, or towards the houses. Carnton itself is about to turn 200 years old in 2 years, and it is in a constant need of maintenance and preservation and upkeep. So if those are the things you're interested in, you can always go to the support tab on the BOFT's website and send money financially. Other things that you can do: visit the sites, take tours, explore the battlefields, take a tour at any of the homes, and leave impacted by this story. And then for homebrew history, you can just go and search any place that you get your podcast, and we're there. The Dispatch is also available on just about every podcast platform. I think the only place that it's not currently now is Google Podcasts, and that's as they kind of roll out of having a podcast network altogether. But it's all there.
Excellent. And I will leave links for those podcasts and the Battle of Franklin Trust in the podcast description. Any final thoughts before we wrap up here, Joe?
I guess the last thing I would say is that this is it's an incredible site. It's an incredible story. And I think that if you come to Franklin, you can really get a chance to understand what the last few months of the war really looked like. This aching, cruel war would finally be over by April of 1865. And when it was over, 4 million people would experience freedom for the very first time, and a nation would be saved. But that only happens when you have a fight at places like Franklin. So these are battlefields to think about that and to reflect upon that, but also a battlefield where we can come to learn some incredible, amazing individual stories of human drama and bravery, and all the things that it takes to fight and win here at Franklin, and ultimately save the nation. So if you come to Franklin and you don't think about the larger picture, you miss the entire point.
Excellent. And all that is left to say, Joe, is thank you very much.
Thank you.
And cheers.
Absolutely.